Welcome back to On the Same Page. We are on Daf Nun Amar Aleph, 50a of Maseches Kiddushin. We're starting from the Mishnah at the bottom. The Mishnah says, 2 lines from the bottom, Hamakadesh shtei nashim b'shava pruta. If a man tries to betroth 2 women with 1 pruta altogether. Now that's not enough to betroth 2 women. Again, technically from a Torah standpoint, a man is allowed to marry 2 wives. He could betroth 2 women, but 1 pruta won't do it because that's only half a pruta each. So if he tries to betroth 2 women with 1 pruta, isha achas bepachos mishava pruta, or 1 woman with less than a pruta. So in both of those cases, that's not going to work. That's not going to be a Kiddushin. But the Mishnah says, Af al pi sheshalach zivlonos la'achar mikan. Even if he would then send gifts afterwards, zivlonos are the gifts that a chasan, a groom, would send to his, or a man who's engaged would send, who's has erusin, would send to his future wife. So even if he sends those gifts, eina mikudeshes, that's not Kiddushin. Meaning even if those gifts are worth more than a pruta, which I hope that they are, still it's not going to be a Kiddushin. Shemachmas Kiddushin harishonim shalach. Because he wasn't sending those gifts as Kiddushin. He was assuming that the original money he gave was the Kiddushin. There's already Kiddushin, they're already betrothed, and now he's sending her gifts. But those gifts aren't Kiddushin. So therefore, even though he sends the gifts, there's no Kiddushin here, because he was counting on the original Kiddushin, the original money that he gave, and that was less than a pruta, so that wasn't a good Kiddushin. V'chein katan shekidesh. Mishnah says, so too for a child that gives Kiddushin, and that Kiddushin, he's not able to get a boy under the age of bar mitzvah, can't give Kiddushin, so if he gives Kiddushin and it doesn't work, and then when he gets older he sends gifts after he's reached the age that he could give Kiddushin, he sends gifts. Again, we say that they're not betrothed because he was counting on the Kiddushin he gave when he was still a child, and that didn't work. So, and these gifts weren't giving us Kiddushin, so there's no Kiddushin here. Says the Gemara Utsricha. The Gemara says it was necessary to teach all 3 of these cases. We really have 3 cases here. We have the case where a man gives 2 women 1 pruta altogether. Then we have the case where a man gives 1 woman less than a pruta. And then the 3rd case is where the boy gave Kiddushin. And in all those cases, if later he sends gifts, we said it's not meant as Kiddushin, and the gifts won't help. There's no Kiddushin here. So the Gemara says it was necessary to teach all 3 of these cases. Di ashma inan shava pruta, because I only taught me the first case. The first case where he gives a 1 pruta to 2 women, we say it's not Kiddushin, and even when he sends gifts afterwards, there's no Kiddushin because he was relying on the Kiddushin, which wasn't the Kiddushin. The gifts are not the Kiddushin. So had it only taught me that, I might have said, ID dekanafik mamona mine ta'i. I would have said that there, since at the end of the day he gave a whole pruta, so he gave the amount that's a Kiddushin. So maybe in that case, in his mind, he thought it was a Kiddushin, and therefore when he sent the gifts, he was relying on that original Kiddushin, which wasn't a good Kiddushin, so we don't have a Kiddushin here. Maybe that's true in the case where he gave a whole pruta. Ava pachos mishava pruta. But in the case where he gave less than a pruta to the woman and then sent her gifts, Ema, I might say, Yodea she'en Kiddushin tovsim b'pachos mishava pruta. He knows that Kiddushin didn't work, the one that was less than a pruta. He knows that Kiddushin doesn't take effect with less than a pruta. And when he sends these gifts, Adaita to Kiddushin kameshader. He's sending them with the intent that they should be the Kiddushin. Since he knows that less than a pruta doesn't work, when he sends the gifts afterwards, he means for that to be Kiddushin, and we might have said that there is a good Kiddushin here. That's why the Mishnah had to tell me that case and say, no, that even in that case, we don't say that. We say that we assume if he sends gifts after having done a Kiddushin, that he's relying on that original Kiddushin, and even though that original Kiddushin was with half a pruta, he's still relying on that. But since it's not a good Kiddushin, so then we don't have any Kiddushin here. V'yashminan hanitarti, and had the Gemara only taught me those two cases, the case where he gives a pruta to two women and then gives gifts, or the case where he gives half a pruta to one woman and then gives gifts. If it only taught me those two cases, and taught me that in those cases he's relying on that original faulty Kiddushin, I would have said, Mishum debein pruta lepachas mishav pruta lo kim lehu le'inshi. I would have said that, okay, there he thinks that first Kiddushin works because he doesn't realize there's a difference between one pruta and half a pruta. That's why he tried to give her half a pruta. He didn't realize that there's a difference. And he's relying on that original Kiddushin, which wasn't a good Kiddushin. Ava katan shekidesh, but in the case where a child gave Kiddushin, hakol yodin shein Kiddushin katan klum. Everybody knows that the Kiddushin offered by a child isn't anything, doesn't work. So I should say, Kika mishader sivlonos, that when he gets older and then sends her gifts, adaita de Kiddushika mishader, he's sending those with the intention that they should be the Kiddushin. Kamash Malan, comes the Mishnah to teach us that no, that even in that case, where he offered her Kiddushin as when he was a child, and then sent her the typical gifts that one might send when betrothed, we still say there's still no Kiddushin here, because we don't assume that we might have said, well, he knows that original Kiddushin wasn't good, and now when he sends the gifts, that's what he means to be the Kiddushin. Says the Mishnah, no, we don't say that. We assume that he's still relying on that original Kiddushin, and therefore, since that original Kiddushin wasn't a good Kiddushin, there's no Kiddushin here. Okay, says the Gemara Itmar, there was a statement made. Rav Huna says, Choshishin l'sivlonos. We are choshish, we're concerned when one sends gifts. What's the case he's talking about? So Rashi explains, we're talking about that there was a shidduch made. They discussed this marriage in advance, and they agreed to it. No Kiddushin was made yet, but they agreed they're going to get betrothed. And then he sent these gifts over. So how do we view that? Is he giving her Kiddushin with those gifts? They're not the typical way to give Kiddushin. But on the other hand, they discussed the marriage, and then he sent this, so maybe that's meant as Kiddushin. So Rav Huna says we have to be choshish. We have to be concerned that this was a real Kiddushin, and if she would decide she wants to marry someone else, she would need a get from this man. V'chein amar Rabba, and Rabba said the same thing. Choshin l'sivlonos. In that type of case, where they discussed the marriage and then they sent gifts, he sent gifts, we have to be choshish, we have to be concerned that he was sending those as Kiddushin. Amar Rabba then said, Umosvina nashmaitzin. But we can ask a contradiction from a brisa on this teaching. The brisa says, Afal pi sheshalach savonos la'achar mikan. Sorry, excuse me, he's asking from the Mishnah. He's asking from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that in the case where he sent a half a pruta, or he gave a pruta to two women, even if he sends gifts afterwards, that's not Kiddushin. So the Mishnah says the Mishnah, even though he sent gifts afterwards, it's not Kiddushin. And the Mishnah doesn't say you have to be choshesh, you have to be concerned that maybe he meant the gifts to be Kiddushin. So too here. Very nice, they discussed the shidduch, but then he sent gifts. So the implication of our Mishnah is when it's just gifts, we don't have to be concerned that he meant the gifts to be the Kiddushin. Amar le Abaye said, no, that's not a problem. Hasam kedikatani taima. The Mishnah it says the reason why there we're not concerned, or we assume that they're not meant for Kiddushin. Shemach mas Kiddushin arishonim shalach. The Mishnah said because there we assume that he was having in mind the original Kiddushin. Meaning, it's a very different case, the case of our Mishnah. The case of our Mishnah was he gave her a Kiddushin. It wasn't a good Kiddushin, but he gave her a half a pruta. And then he sent her gifts. So there we say the gifts are not Kiddushin, because he was having in mind that half a pruta was the Kiddushin, and it's not, so there's no Kiddushin here. But our case that we're talking about now is where there was there was no Kiddushin given before. They actually discussed the Shidduch, but then he never sent Kiddushin. And now he's sending these gifts. So here, it makes sense that we should be choshesh, we should be concerned for Kiddushin. That's one version of that conversation. The Gemara says, Ikada Amri, there are those who say that the conversation went as follows. Amar Rabba, that Rabba said, Mina minala. So Rabba taught this teaching that, at Rabba and Rav Huna, that when a person is, if they discuss the shidduch, they discussed the match, and then he sent gifts. They said, there you have to be concerned that those gifts are Kiddushin. So Rabba says, Mina minala. From where do I know that? Gitikatani Taima. I know it from this Mishnah, our Mishnah. Because the Mishnah said the reason in the case of the Mishnah, where he first sent her, let's say, a half a pruta for Kiddushin, and then he sent her the gifts, the reason why the gifts there are not Kiddushin is Shemach mas Kiddushin arishonim shalach. Because he's having in mind the original Kiddushin, which wasn't a good Kiddushin. And the implication is, Hachahu detai. Here is where we think he would make a mistake. When he sends the gifts, he's not having those that might be the Kiddushin, he's having in mind the original Kiddushin that he gave. Ba'alma, but the implication is that in general though, when a person sends gifts, if there was no previous Kiddushin, and certainly when there was a shidduch discussed, but there was no prior Kiddushin, he's just the first thing he sent her after discussing the shidduch was the gifts, Ba'alma havu Kiddushin. In general, we would assume that they are Kiddushin. That was what Rabbi said. That's why we have to be choshish, we have to be concerned that these gifts were meant for Kiddushin. In the Mishnah, the only reason we weren't concerned about the gifts was because there was a prior Kiddushin. But over here, there was no prior attempt at Kiddushin. We assume that we have to be at least concerned that these gifts were meant for Kiddushin. The Abaye, and Abaye responds to that. So in the first version, Abaye was answering, Rabba had asked the question on himself from the Mishnah, and Abaye answered it. Now, in this version, Rabba is bringing a proof to himself from the Mishnah, and Abaye is responding to that proof. The Abaye says back, Lo mi bayi ka'amar. No, you have to read the Mishnah in the style of Lo mi bayi. Lo mi bayi means that it wasn't necessary to say, it's not even necessary to say this, but even this. Lo mi bayi ba'alma. It's not necessary, the Mishnah is saying, to tell you that in a normal case, or not a normal case, in general, in a case like the case we're discussing now, where there was no previous Kiddushin, he just sends the gifts. Dilo nachas l'taras Kiddushin klal. In this case, Abaye says, in our case, there was no Kiddushin at all. No attempt, no nothing. They discussed the shidduch and then he sent gifts. But there was no attempt at Kiddushin. So that's for sure not Kiddushin, Abaye says. The Mishnah is saying that Ela Filo Hacha. Even in the case of the Mishnah, Dinachas L'Taras Kiddushin, where he made an attempt at Kiddushin. Ema Havu Kiddushin, there I might say that the gifts that he sends as after, maybe we should view those as a second attempt at Kiddushin. And there should be a Kiddushin. Kamash Malan, that's what the Mishnah is coming to tell me, that even that's not Kiddushin. So, while Rabba was inferring from the Mishnah that it's only the case of the Mishnah that it's not Kiddushin, but Be'alma, in a general case, if there wasn't a prior attempt at Kiddushin that he might be relying on, but rather the gifts are the first thing that he's sending, Rabba says we have to be concerned that that's a Kiddushin. Abaye says no, it goes the other way around. That's obvious, that the Mishnah didn't even have to say. if he didn't even offer her any Kiddushin, we don't have to be concerned that these gifts are Kiddushin. It's only in the case where he first tried to offer her a half pruta for Kiddushin, and then he sent her the gifts. There we have to be, you might have thought that we should be concerned that that's Kiddushin. That's what the Mishnah came to tell me, that, no, we don't say this is a second attempt at Kiddushin. We say that he was relying on the first Kiddushin, which wasn't a good Kiddushin, so there's no Kiddushin here. Okay, so we have here a machlokas. Do we have to be concerned for this Kiddushin or not? On the one hand, in this Ikadamri at least, we have Rabbah saying that in this case where they talked about a shidduch, and then he sent gifts, we have to be concerned that those gifts are Kiddushin, and the Abaye says there's no concern. So the Gemara asks, "My have Allah." So what happens in the end? How do we rule? So Amar Rav Papa says it depends what people do in that place. Be'asra demekadshi v'hadar misavli, in a place where it's normal to first give Kiddushin and then send gifts. Chayshina. So then we have to be concerned. We have to be concerned that these gifts were the Kiddushin. Because normally you first give Kiddushin, then you give gifts. So the first thing you do is give Kiddushin. So maybe these things, which were the first thing that he sent, are the Kiddushin. But Misabli v'hadar mekadshi, but if it's a place where they normally send gifts and only do the Kiddushin afterwards, lo chashin, and then you don't have to be concerned that the gifts are Kiddushin. That's normal to send gifts before Kiddushin, and we have no concern that those gifts are Kiddushin. That's what Rav Papa said. So again, in a place where they normally send the Kiddushin first, you have to be concerned that these gifts are the Kiddushin. In a place where they normally send gifts before the Kiddushin, you don't have to be concerned that the gifts are Kiddushin. Says the Gemara, mekadshi v'hadar misabli pshita. The case where in a place where they normally send Kiddushin first and then the gifts, obviously you should have to be concerned that these gifts are the Kiddushin. Whatever he sends first, that's the Kiddushin. So what is Rabbah teaching me, what is Rav Papa teaching me, when he says that if it's a place that they normally first do Kiddushin and then send the gifts, that you have to be concerned about the Kiddushin. Yeah, so I think part of the question is that in this case, meaning I guess I'm a little bothered because he was just contrasting. So why do we have to say so it's obvious, okay? But he was contrasting the two different types of places. So I'm not so bothered by this question. I'm just wondering if there's maybe more to this question. I'm just wondering out loud now, if maybe what the Gemara really is concerned is that if we're talking about a place where they normally send Kiddushin first, then the language that the Amoraim used of chosheshes, you have to be concerned that it's Kiddushin, maybe that's the problem. It's pshita, it's obvious that it should be considered Kiddushin. He sends the gifts, he sends Kiddushin first always in this place. So maybe the language of you should be concerned is maybe too relaxed. That we should say it is Kiddushin. So the Gemara says lo tzricha, no, it's necessary. It's not obvious that it's Kiddushin here, or at least that we should be concerned it's Kiddushin, because we're talking about deruba mekadshi v'hadar misabli. We're talking about where most people first give the Kiddushin and then the gifts. Umiyuta misabli v'hadar mekadshi. But there is a minority that actually gives the gifts and then the Kiddushin. So common practice, the majority of people give Kiddushin first. But there's a minority that send the gifts first. Now this person sent the gifts first. So how should we relate to those gifts? Do we have to be concerned that they are Kiddushin like the majority? Or that can we assume that it's not like the minority? Mao de tema, what might I have thought to say nechush l'miyuta? We should be concerned for the minority. Meaning, we should be lenient here. what it's really saying is that we should be able to rely on the minority here. Kamash Malan comes the Republic to teach me that no, we have to be, or come these Amoraim to teach me that no, we have to be concerned that there's a Kiddushin here. In other words, majority of people do Kiddushin and then send the gifts. There's a minority that sends the gifts first. This man sent the gifts first. Or he sent gifts. We don't know if it was gifts first or if it was Kiddushin first. So how should we relate? Now you would think that, go with the majority. We should assume that he means it for Kiddushin. On the other hand, there's a minority that does the gifts first. Maybe it's not Kiddushin. So you might have thought that you would rely on that minority. Now, why would you think to rely on the minority? So there's different approaches in the Rishonim. In the commentaries, one approach is because there's a chazaka right now. Her current status is that she's not married. She's not mikudeshes. So we're trying to change her status. So maybe maybe you might have thought that you can the majority here is not good enough. Relying on majority is not enough to change her status from single to betrothed, and that's what you might have thought. But no, the Gemara is coming to tell me that no, we do not assume like the minority, and we will change her status based on since the majority of people send the Kiddushin first. So therefore, when he sends the gifts, we will assume, or at least be concerned, that they're meant for Kiddushin, and we will consider them to be betrothed, and if she wants to marry someone else, she'll need a get. Ba mine Rav Acha bar Rav Huna me Rava. Rav Acha bar Rav Huna asked a question of Rava. Huchzak shtar ksuva b'shuk mahu. If sorry. Rav Acha bar Rav Huna asked a question of Rava. Huchzak shtar ksuva b'shuk mahu. They found a ksuba in the shuk, or it was known that there was a ksuba with his and her names on it in the shuk. Ksuba is the marriage contract. So they found this marriage contract in the marketplace, or it was known that there was everybody knew there was a marriage contract with their names on it. Mahu. What is the halacha? Do we assume that she must be married? If there's a marriage contract with his and her names on it, do we assume they must be married? In which case, if she then gets Kiddushin from someone else, it's not Kiddushin. Or just having a marriage contract out there doesn't necessarily tell us anything. That was the question. So Amarle, Rava said, just because there's a contract out there, we're going to assume that she's a married woman? Meaning, it could be that he got the contract written up, but who says that they actually ever got betrothed? Maybe he just had the contract written. So Rava says that shouldn't prove anything of her status. Just having a ksuba with his and her names on it, so he had the ksuba prepared, but what, that doesn't tell us anything more than that. It's just a contract. So that was the question Rav Acha bar Rav Huna asked, and Rava basically seems to have dismissed the question. The existence of a contract shouldn't make a difference. So my Have Allah. So the Gemara says, well, so what's the final conclusion? So Rav Ashi says it depends on the place. Ba'asra demekachi v'adar kasi ksuba. In a place where they normally do the Kiddushin first, and then they write the ksuba, then they write the contract, chashina. Then we have to be concerned that they're actually married, because the contract's normally written only after, in this place, only after they already have Kiddushin. So if there's a contract, we have to be concerned that there's Kiddushin. But kasvi v'hadar mekachi, but in a place where they normally write the contract first, they write the ksuba first, and then they do the Kiddushin, we don't have to be concerned. Because just because there's a contract doesn't mean that there ever was a Kiddushin after that. Ask the Gemara, that's obvious. A place where they do the Kiddushin first, and then they write the contract, then they write the Ksuba, that's obvious. That we should be concerned for this Ksuba. If we're in a place where they normally write the Kiddushin first, and then they give the Ksuba, so if there's a Ksuba, we have to be concerned that there was a Kiddushin. That should be obvious. So he explains, although it's still necessary to teach you this, because we could be talking about a place, Safra. It could be that in a place where there's not a sofer around. There's nobody around who writes contracts. So what might I have said? Safra disrami. That the reason why he wrote the contract was because there happened to be a sofer passing through town. But not because they did the Kiddushin first. Kamash Malan. So it comes to teach me that still we still will assume that they did the Kiddushin first. In other words, again, the Gemara is saying that Rav Ashi said what's something that seems to be obvious. That if you live in a place where they usually first do Kiddushin and then write the Ksuba, then you have to be concerned that, and you find a Ksuba, you have to assume that there was a Kiddushin already, because they normally do Kiddushin followed by writing the Ksuba. So we said that's obvious. So Rav says it's not always obvious, because you can have a scenario where they live in a town where there's no sofer. And so in such a place, if there's a sofer passing through town, there's someone who could write a contract passing through town, you got to take advantage. So maybe this guy knew he wanted to marry this girl. He was planning to offer her Kiddushin. There was a sofer passing through town. He's like, oh great, let's get the ksuba written up right now while we can. And so even though it's a place that they normally do Kiddushin first and then write the ksuba, but in a place like that, if they also don't have a sofer around, so then it could switch, it could change. So you might have said that in such a place we can assume that they wrote the ksuba first. We don't have to assume that the Kiddushin happened first. So that's what the Mishnah is coming to teach, or not the Mishnah, that's what Rav Ashi is coming to teach me, that even in such a place we will assume that if there's a ksuba, it must be, and it's a place where they normally do Kiddushin, and then they write the ksuba, it must be that they already did the Kiddushin. Okay, says the Mishnah, Hamakadesh Isho Bita. If a man tries to betroth a woman and her daughter at the same time, O Isha V'Achosa, or a woman and her sister, Ka'achas, at the same time. So a man is not able to marry a mother and a daughter. Kiddushin doesn't take effect. If he's married to a woman, he can't marry her daughter. It won't take effect. If he's married to a woman, he can't marry her sister. It won't take effect. So if he tries to marry them both, to betroth them both at the same time, Ka'achas at once, Einan Mikudashos. Neither of them are betrothed. The whole thing doesn't work. Says the Mishnah, Umaisa b'chamesh nashim. There was actually a story where there were 5 women, Ubahen shtei achios, and among the 5 women were 2 sisters. Velikit adam echad kalkala shal ta'enim, and a man went and he gathered a basket of figs, b'shalahen ha'isa, belonging to them actually, he gathered it from their fields. It's not clear whose fields, maybe the sisters. The Gemara is going to discuss later the significance of that. B'shal shvius ha'isa, and it was the Shemitah year, so during a Shemitah year, all the produce is hefker. A person's allowed to gather from other people's fields. So he went to gather from somebody else's fields, or some of these women's at least, maybe even the sisters. And he said to the 5 women, here, take this basket of figs, and it's going to be Kiddushin for all 5 of you. V'kibla achas mehen al yidei kulan, and one of them accepted it on behalf of everybody. So what's the halacha? Is there a Kiddushin here? So the Chacham said, the sages said, Ein achios mikudashos. The 2 sisters are not betrothed. So it sounds like the 3 other women, there were 5 women here, but 2 of them were sisters. So the three other women, there's a Kiddushin. You could betroth multiple women at the same time. But if you try and betroth two sisters, since neither of them could be betrothed at the same time as the other one, neither of it works. None of them work. Ask the Gemara, Minahani Mili. From where do we know this? How do we know that in such a case, the Kiddushin won't work for either of them? So Amar Rami Bar Chama said, De Amar Kra, because the verse says, Ve'ishal achosa lo sikach. A man, to a woman, to her sister shouldn't take, meaning he can't take the sister of his wife. Litzur, to be a rival wife. HaTorah Amra, so this is the prohibition that you can't marry two sisters. HaTorah Amra, the Torah says, Bisha shenasu tzara zu lazu lo yehe lo likuchim afil b'achas mehem. The Gemara is darshaning, is learning out from here that it's understanding that it's happening at the same time. V'isha achosa lo sikach. A woman and to her sister you should not take. You shouldn't take them at the same time. Litzror, to make them into rival sisters. That if you do that, neither of them will work. Amar le Rava, so Rava said, Ihachi, if that's true, Hainu dechsev. So that's what it says, that those who do this will be cut off, spiritual excision, kares, from their nation. If Kiddushin doesn't take effect, how could you be chayiv? Why would you be chayiv kares? Why would there be a punishment or a severe punishment? In other words, I understand if a man is married to a woman, so he's married to her, he now has a prohibition to marry her sister. And it could be kares if he has relations with her sister. Not just to marry her sister, but to have relations with her sister would be a kares violation. But if he's not married to either of them, and he's trying to marry them, so there's no prohibition of lying, of having relations with his wife's sister, because it's not his wife yet. So the Gemara is saying, Rav is saying, I don't understand. How could there be a chiyuv kares here, if he's not married to either of them? So the case of the pasuk cannot be where he wasn't married to either of them, where he was trying to marry them both at the same time, and neither of them took effect, because then why would there be a kares obligation? It's not his wife's sister. He doesn't have a wife. Ela amar Rava, so rather Rava says, Kra b'zachar zeh. The pasuk is talking about where it's one after the other. Don't marry a woman and then try to marry her sister or have relations with her sister, because that would be having relations with his wife's sister. That's a chiyuv kares. That's what the pasuk is discussing. Umas nising in our Mishnah, which says that if you would try to marry two sisters at the same time, betroth two sisters at the same time, neither would take effect. Kidda Rabba is going like the teaching of Rabba. Da'amar Rabba, because Rabba said, Kol she'eno b'zachar zeh, anything that won't take effect one after the other, afilu b'vas achas eino, also doesn't work at the same time. So Rabba is saying this misvara, he's saying this based on logic, and the Gemara that we will continue with next week will start to examine Rabba's teaching, but Rabba sets out a rule, a logical rule. The rule is that if something cannot take effect one after the other, then it also can't take effect at the same time. So, and since the Kiddushin of his wife's sister can't take effect when it's one after the other, if he's married to one woman or betrothed to one woman and then he tries to betroth her sister, it won't take effect. So since it can't take effect one after the other, it also cannot take effect simultaneously. And that's what Rabba makes that a rule, and Rava is saying that that's the rule that's being applied in our Mishnah, and that's why this doesn't work. In other words, the Gemara asked, how do we know that when you try to marry two sisters at the same time it doesn't work? And Rava's answer is, because we know that one after the other doesn't work. We know that from the pasuk, and anything that doesn't work one after the other, Rabbah teaches won't work at the same time. And that will be the source. And next week's Gemara will examine Rabbah's teaching further.